Hi, I'm April Baer, in for Dave Miller, and this is Think Out Loud. This fall, after a shooter opened fire in a Roseburg Community College classroom, President Obama urged the nation to consider stronger gun laws. Oregon has recently debated gun law changes. Just weeks prior to the Roseburg shooting, a new law took effect that requires universal background checks for gun buyers. Now, these are already the norm at gun shops and gun shows. But since August, people who acquire a gun in a person-to-person sale are now required to take an extra step. They must go to a gun dealer and request a criminal background check. If you were with us last spring, you might remember that some gun owners we talked to had concerns about this. We went to a gun show in Portland back in April to speak with them about it. Here's Think Out Loud's Dave Blanchard.
Nick Russell is a federal firearms dealer who owns Albany Guns, Coins, and Jewelry. His booth has a near constant flow of customers, even on a sunny spring Friday when turnout at the gun show was low.
We don't let anybody go by without talking to them, usually.
He has salesmen that chat with potential customers about the guns, but the vast majority of his time is spent running background checks.
I log into the state website as soon as my computer comes up.
He walks me through the process with one of his customers who declined to be interviewed.
I type in the person's information, basic information that's on a driver's license.
Things like height, address, eye color.
Phone number.
He fills out one form online, which he submits for the Oregon State Police to review. Then he's got another paper form required by the federal government.
This is a receipt that shows that this person actually bought this gun at this time.
Getting everything entered into the state database and federal forms takes about 5 minutes.
Okay, I've entered all the information.
Then we wait. He tells me about the possible outcomes of the background check.
We get 3 responses: approve, delay, deny.
After waiting for the background check to be processed, most customers get approved. They can get their gun right then. Only a few people get denied.
If they're going to be denied, they don't try to buy one because most people know. You know if you're a criminal.
Delays happen for many reasons. It could be there's a discrepancy between the state's records and the information submitted in the background check.
It could be a problem with his address.
Or it could be the buyer has a record that needs to be looked into.
Maybe he was arrested 5 years ago in another state, and they have to receive a response from that state to state whether he was actually convicted or not.
Russell's conflicted about the way the background check system works.
The good thing about a background check is, from a dealer standpoint, when this is completed, I know this guy's never committed a crime. From the customer, the good point is they know the gun they're buying has never been reported stolen because the system checks both. They check the person and the firearm.
But his biggest problem with the checks?
That right there.
He points at his computer screen. The buyer he's working with is now in a digital queue, waiting for his check to take place.
They haven't even received it yet because there's 19 people still ahead of him waiting to get their information through.
And this is a slow day.
I've seen that number as high as 300.
There are state staffers on the other side of this transaction that have to conduct the checks. Today, it takes about 20 minutes for the approval to come through. Russell says if background checks become nearly universal, the system would be overwhelmed.
Every private gun sale, every garage sale, every auction, every neighbor across the fence decides to do a background check, the system probably wouldn't be able to handle it.
He says the flaws become more apparent if there's a delay or an issue with the paperwork.
For all delayed transactions.
One of his sales today was flagged by the state, so he's told he needs to call a hotline to resolve the issue. He's put on hold for about 15 minutes.
They have my number. They could call me direct, but instead I have to wait to talk to them.
Often it's just a matter of a typo, but the site doesn't allow Russell to correct his submissions. Eventually, he gets a hold of someone.
This is Nick with Albany Guns. Somebody put a notice in here for me to call them.
It turns out the address the state had for the buyer was out of date. Russell had fixed the DMV records himself, but that new information hadn't been processed. He explained that to the state, and the delay was turned into an approval.
Okay. I'll just call him and let him know he got approved then.
He says these bureaucratic delays drag on his business.
Messing with paperwork, messing with the call-in, waiting to get online, waiting to talk to somebody.
He says things moved much more quickly when he used to have to only keep a copy of the federal paperwork.
While you've been here, I've done 5. I could have done 20 if all I do is fill these out and keep them.
And he says if background checks are expanded, it's not just going to be sellers that are negatively affected.
It's going to cause a lot of people to violate a law without knowing anything about it.
Russell says he sees the same thing with the current law. He conducts a background check for every sale, but that's not the case with everyone.
It's about 50-50.
He says it's not always intentional. It can just happen between strangers that meet at the gun show.
Some guy stops him and goes, "What do you want for that gun?" "Oh, I want $500. "Oh, okay, well, I'll buy it from you." And so he buys it, and the guy walks out, and the other guy goes on with his money.
And for as many people as there are who don't know the law, there are plenty who do know it, but simply ignore it, including some of the sellers at the gun show.
There's private guys that are set up here that know the law that aren't following it.
He says that means the new law will be a drag on the people like him who follow it, and toothless for the people who don't.
People aren't following it now at a gun show, and you've got them in a controlled environment. You're going to have it statewide, and you're going to try to enforce it? Of course not.
That story was produced by Think Out Loud's Dave Blanchard. So how are the universal background checks that went into effect August 9th working out? Today we're going to hear more about it. Has this law affected you? Have you bought or sold a gun in a person-to-person sale? Did you go get the background check? You can email us. The address is thinkoutloud@opb.org, and our phone number is 1-888-665-5865. With us today is the co-sponsor of Senate Bill 941. It's Floyd Prozanski. He represents parts of Lane and Douglas counties. Senator Prozanski, welcome back to Think Out Loud.
April, thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, what's your assessment? How are things going from your perspective since the law went into effect on August 9th?
Well, April, at this point, we have not heard anything in the negative of the implementation of the law. We've checked with the state police, and we have not heard of anything or anyone having any great difficulty going through what has been required already for 25 years for federal arms dealers and, as you mentioned, at gun shows, including private or private transfers since 2001. And since this new law went in effect in April, we only have about 2 months time in, but at this point, we have not heard all of the horror stories come true of backlogs, lines, delays, etc.
What kind of feedback have you heard from people like buyers about it?
Actually, none. That's the whole point I guess I'm trying to make, is that we have not heard anything from anyone, at least through my office, and the state police have not referred any information to me regarding complications. You know, it's unfortunate with the shooting that occurred down at UCC. I do believe a lot of people's focus may be in other directions at this point.
But you're saying that the state police have not indicated to you that they're having any kind of capacity problem with this?
That is correct.
Have you heard of have any sheriffs or other law enforcement spoken to you about how they are enforcing the law or if they are enforcing the law?
I have not had direct conversations with any of the sheriffs of the state. We both know that there are a number that came out during the hearings that were stating that they're going to have problems doing it. Of course, I always find that fascinating for someone who's taken the oath to uphold both the state and federal constitutions as well as the laws of the land, to not be willing to enforce it if they have the resources to actually go forward and with enforcement. You know, it's just, you can't have people pick and choose which laws they want to enforce or not enforce. We do have a rule of law, and this is one that's now on the books.
Is there any way of knowing whether the overall number of transactions or the overall number of background checks has gone up at all?
I don't have that information. We're trying to get it for the show, and we have not been able to get any additional. The last report I saw was for August, and so that's a split month, and it looked like it was running about the same. If I remember correctly, the number I saw, there's still about 20,000 plus transactions that are lawfully going through, valid transactions that are occurring with transfers of 20,000 guns per month. This in August, and there was about 173 denials that occurred for the month of August. So that would bring us to about 2,000 per year, which is about what we have been seeing. So I think we're going to have to allow this to kind of mature a little bit and see at the end of the year, once we have a full quarter, to see what impact it's had.
We did ask the Oregon State Police to come and talk to us about what they've seen at this point. They declined that request because of the sensitive nature of the subject. We will try to check in with them again at another time. Senator Floyd Prozanski, a recall campaign was started against you after this bill passed. What did that say to you about how the law was received?
Well, it depends on who you talk about. I guess what I'd say is that I was the fourth of the legislators who had a recall petition filed. Mine was probably the most aggressive on the part of the proponents for that. They spent close to $50,000 in attempting to get the signatures they needed to even qualify it for a vote of the people of the district, and they failed to do that. And so I believe that many people in the district, just like we've seen statewide polling shows, that most people want reasonable protections to ensure felons and people with mental health issues don't have easy access to guns. And to me, that's why they weren't able to even get enough signatures to put on a ballot for a vote.
I believe they only fell short about 200 signatures, though, and they did not submit everything that they had.
Oh, that's correct. But you also have to take in consideration that the way that they actually were gathering the signatures seemed to be improper and more than likely unlawful. And that's why they chose to not put in some of the signatures that they realized were going to be suspect or were in fact suspect. The bottom line is they were not able, even with $50,000, to gather enough signatures to actually put it on a ballot for the voters to actually decide whether or not I should or shouldn't have been recalled on this issue.
Do you think that hostility from constituents is going to make it harder for lawmakers to vote for gun control bills going forward?
I don't think so. I mean, the reality, when you say gun control, we're looking at regulations that reasonable gun owners as well as other citizens believe are appropriate. I've owned guns for 45 years, and I think it's reasonable for us to take these steps that are going to limit the ability for individuals that are felons or domestic violence offenders, as well as people having mental health issues, from having easy access to guns. It's interesting, just on Monday, we had a notice that came out from the International Associations of Chiefs of Police during their conference in Chicago that they actually are endorsing full background checks or universal background checks, which is what this state now has. Also, keep in mind, April, that we did build into the law exceptions for family members. So not all private transactions are required to go through a background check. We do find that it's reasonable to be able to transfer a gun from one family member to another without having the background check. But clearly, if we want to put a dent as to easy access to guns for felons or people with mental health issues, you need to do these background checks. And I'm really happy to hear that the International Association of Chiefs of Police have agreed to this, and they have made that one of their top priorities.
President Obama did call for changes to gun laws after the Umpqua Community College shooting. I take it you agree with him?
Well, I think we need to be looking at what is reasonable as to what we can or can't do. I think that a lot of the stuff that we have constituents want us to do in this area does need to be done at the federal level because without having a national law, it's going to be very hard to enforce many of the, let's say, proposed changes that we've heard or seen that have been brought forward, not only here in Oregon, but across the country in various states.
Well, is there anything specific, given the priorities that you said just a couple minutes ago, is there anything you would like to work on in the 2016 or 2017 session to further guard against mass shootings?
There is. Remember, in Senate Bill 941, we had three components to it. One of the other components was to allow for judges, when they had someone that was before them, to determine whether or not they're going to be required to have outpatient mental health treatment. We're now requiring the judges to make a determination whether or not that individual, while they're under court order for mental health treatment, should have access to guns. So what we're looking at is potentially allowing for what the state already provides for in another context, where a medical provider could, in fact, notify law enforcement if they have a patient who they believe is unstable and they should not be having access to weapons because of their mental state at that point in time.
Hey, before we let you go, we're going to hear a little bit later in the show about a local measure that's on the ballot in Coos County that's designed to push back against Senate Bill 941 and other laws. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, I'm kind of surprised that you would see that. First of all, in 1995, the state basically has moved forward in preempting local regulation of gun regulations, with a few exceptions. And the one I understand that's being proposed as an ordinance in Coos County would, in fact, be in violation of the state law on that part. And clearly, if someone believes that Senate Bill 941 or any part of our background check law that's been in effect for 25 years is unconstitutional, they should take it to the courts directly and allow the courts to make that determination. But we both know that they won't do that because it's been very clear from the Supreme Court decisions that what we did with 941 is in fact constitutional, and this is just another means for a few individuals to basically express frustrations where they apparently want to have easy access to guns for people with felony convictions as well as people with mental health issues.
We've been talking with Senator Floyd Prozanski, who is the co-sponsor of Senate Bill 941, which is now an Oregon law as of August 9th. Senator, we're going to let you go, but thanks for making time for us today.
April, thank you very much for the opportunity. Have a great day.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking about how Oregon's new universal background check law is working out. Let's add Irene Gilbert to the conversation now. She runs the Oregon Trail Trader. They sell firearms from handguns to hunting rifles and more in La Grande. Irene, welcome to Think Out Loud.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, tell us how this is working out in your experience. Have people been coming to your shop for background checks on person-to-person sales since early August?
Well, actually, right after I got the call asking if I wanted to be on this show, I went and checked our logbook for the number of background checks that we had done. And the period of time that I checked for was from the 1st of September to the 10th of October. And during that period, we processed 58 guns that we had sold. We processed one private transfer of a gun. And of the 58 that we did process, one gun was pended and then approved, and one gun purchaser was denied. And actually, that was a 92-year-old gentleman living alone who wanted to purchase a .25 caliber pistol for protection. And if you're not familiar with calibers, it's slightly larger than a .22. He sat in our store for 2 hours waiting for an approval, was denied, and when the policeman followed up, he just came back and said, I told him how to clear it up. So that is our actual experience for, a 5-week period. We've also had at least one person come in because one of the services that we provide is we basically will tell people what guns are worth and either, whether they're trying to sell them to us or whatever. And had one gentleman come in asking us to help him put a price on his gun, and he almost apologetically said, I have no plans on running a background check on this rifle, so I hope you don't think you're going to get money for that.
Huh.
And people just aren't doing it. That's the bottom line. We also talked with another gun dealer in town who said he had processed for one individual since the law has come into place, private transfer.
Right. We heard concerns before the law was passed that this might have a detrimental effect on business for gun dealers, that people might choose to, as you say, to just take their transactions offline out of gun shops. Can you tell if this is having any effect on the business that you do?
I think the only effect is with us only having one process, the impact that it's having on us is we are very concerned and very confused about what the expectation is. We have gotten no instruction from the state police. And quite honestly, I'm of the opinion that Senator Prozanski and the chief of police from Portland ought to get together with ATF, because ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, is telling us everything has to go in the book. And once it goes into our logbook, that means we have to have physical possession of a gun. So if this case had pended, we would have been left in the position of having to take someone's gun and keep it at our store until it got cleared. Now, that's the kind of situation where I would expect us to have big problems, and it's the kind of thing that really needs to be clarified. The state police can say, this is no problem, it takes 57 seconds or whatever, and they get their $10. It's very common that our customers are waiting an hour for us to clear clear a gun that we have sold.
So let's talk this through. Let's say that a potential buyer and a potential seller were to come in and they say, okay, here's the weapon in question, and here's the buyer in question, asking you to run a background check. If you're saying if that background check for the buyer came back denied, you are technically in possession of the firearm at that point, and
right.
It's not clear. What your next move is not clear if the transaction can't go forward.
Right, because from our perspective, from ATF's perspective, we now have possession of that gun, and we legally can't release a gun unless we have a legal person to release it from. So are we supposed to charge the person who brought the gun in another $45 so that we can make sure that he legally can get his own gun back? That's one of the questions.
Has this happened yet? Has this come up yet in practice?
No, but it will, because, it may take a while, especially if we're only getting one private sale, for a month and a half. But it happens. Gun sales are denied periodically. About 1% of the purchasers, like this old gentleman, was denied.
Sure.
So it's inevitable that it's going to happen. It's going to happen even more, even quicker, I'd say. The number that they're pending, that we're going to end up with a pending case with a gun that ATF would say has to be in our book. If it has to be in our book, we have to have the gun. How would you feel if you were the owner of that gun, trying to sell it, and you had a dealer say, I'm going to keep your gun because we don't know whether or not this purchase is going to go through? Right.
Irene, have you and your partner given any thought to just saying, we're not going to do these checks for person-to-person sales. We're just going to stay out of this part of state regulation?
We talked about it, and actually we talked about it with some other dealers in town, and it's one of those things where I guess our preference would be not to do it, but at the same time, just because of the liability around things like if we're keeping your guns and having angry customers who are paying for a gun check that they don't want to have to pay for. But we just decided that part of our appeal is we try to provide good customer service. And I guess what we came down to is, while we disagree with the law, if someone actually comes into our store and says, will you do this, we're going to charge them the $35 for doing the check and $10 to go to the state police, and we'll go ahead and do it for them.
Sure. Irene Gilbert, the touchstone for this whole conversation was the kind of laws that might prevent the kind of shootings that we saw in Roseburg at the end of last month. Can you imagine any kind of law that might have a preventive effect?
The issue with this is, and it came up at the legislature, and that is this law would not have kept any of the examples that were given from happening. They were stolen guns. They were, taken from a family member. This law doesn't change any of that. And there was one of the frustrating things for me as a person who sells guns was having people like, quite honestly, Senator Prozanski, who was so arrogant that when I went down to testify and try to educate him about the problems of this bill, 86% of those who appeared to testify against this bill, he refused to hear from. He has been unwilling to refer this bill to the citizens for a vote by referendum. So obviously he's not certain that all of the citizens support it. He included an emergency clause, which meant that you can't stop this bill with an initiative, and now the only way to stop it would be by taking each individual piece of it and doing a separate initiative. He was willing to accept, without question, a document from Bloomberg's group called Every Town for Gun Safety that says no questions asked, and I think that was probably a really good title for it, because it said things like, assume that every gun listed on the internet was being sold to a criminal by someone who was unlicensed and that trades were happening in back alleys. And I can tell you that it's been illegal to mail a firearm since 1993, I believe, is when it became illegal. Most of those guns, if they sell, are mailed. A few are person-to-person exchanges, but oftentimes it's just someone who buys, sells, and trades guns as sort of a hobby, or it's someone who, quite honestly, doesn't trust people like Prozanski with the information, so they don't want government to know what's going on with their guns. And I just find it incredible that someone like Michael Bloomberg, from a state with a much higher crime rate than ours, was able to put together a political action group called Every Town for Gun Safety and spend $600,000 in order to buy enough politicians to pass a bill that our police forces don't agree with, our county commissioners don't agree with, but both of the people in this state don't agree with. That's not
Irene,
about
are you talking about the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
so it really makes me discouraged about the future of democracy in a state when $600,000 can pass a bill like this.
Irene, I'm sorry, we do need to get to the break, but I really want to thank you for sharing your experience with us on the new background check bill. Irene Gilbert runs Oregon Trail Trader in La Grande. Thanks very much for making some time for us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Coming up after the break, we're going to hear about a ballot measure in Coos Bay that would give the county sheriff some new interpretive powers in handling gun laws at the local level. You're with Think Out Loud on OPB. It's Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm April Baer. Today we're talking about gun laws in Oregon, both new and proposed. When word started getting around that the state legislature was considering universal background checks, a former optician in Bandon started thinking about ways to counteract the plan. Rob Taylor has filed an initiative petition, and it asserts the right of the county sheriff to determine which gun laws will be enforced under his jurisdiction. This is going to be on the ballot in Coos County November 3rd as Measure 6151. Rob Taylor is with us now by phone. Rob, welcome to Think Out Loud.
Hi, April. Thank you for having me on.
So why did you decide to put this measure on the ballot rather than, say, maybe making a legal challenge to the new state law?
Well, like most people, I'm an average citizen, and I don't have the kind of funds that it would take to hire an attorney and challenge it on a legal level. So I did the next best thing. I took Oregon's very liberal initiative laws, and I tried to enact an initiative that, and let me correct you, that would not give the sheriff more discretionary powers, but allow him to use existing discretionary powers to make the SB 941 law a low or no priority. And on top of that, what the idea was we wanted to create a sanctuary county in Coos County the same way that Springfield has created a sanctuary city as a safe haven for illegal immigrants. And by the way, Floyd Prozanski is a representative of Springfield, and it's kind of strange that he would talk about us going against state law when he has a city in his own district that's going against state law.
Rob, can you give us an example of how your initiative measure might be enforced if it passes?
Yes. Just like the lady who was speaking earlier from the gun shop, there could be a gun owner or gun store that refuses to give back a gun shop refusing to give back a gun owner his guns for a certain reason. At that point in time, an individual may go to the district attorney and say that the store or the pawn shop or whoever this outlet is violating their constitutional rights, and at that point they may have a case according to Measure 6151.
Right. So then what action would you foresee happening?
I have no idea. You're asking me to speculate, but the thing is we want these challenges so that it would force the law into the courts without us having to pay for it, so that the courts can justify the constitutionality of both the laws.
Right. Well, let's add the sheriff of Coos County to the conversation. Craig Zanni is joining us as well today on Think Out Loud. Sheriff Zanni, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
May I ask, what was your reaction when you heard about the measure?
Well, I was not surprised at all by the measure because it's quite easy to understand. Is there was a lot that preceded that when Senate Bill 941 was in the works. A group of citizens had asked the Board of Commissioners to send a letter to the state expressing that they didn't support it, and basically that the restriction on law-abiding gun owners isn't the problem. The problem is that we have people who are either of a criminal nature or mentally ill, and those were the issues that needed to be addressed. And that didn't happen, and so they took the initiative to kind of make a statement is, every time something goes bad, why do we keep putting more restrictions on law-abiding citizens?
Well, let me talk this through with you the same way we just did with Rob Taylor. Let's say, for example, there's a situation at a gun shop where a potential buyer and a potential seller come in with the weapon in question, and they ask the gun shop owner, "Would you do a background check for us?" And if the if the background check comes back denied, and the gun shop owner is in the position then where he or she feels he needs to hold on to the weapon. It appears that what Rob Taylor's measure is suggesting is that it would then be within the sheriff's department's powers to intervene. How could you see enforcement working under 6151?
Well, that's actually no different than the law is now, because there are some situations. For example, let's say it was a case between two felons. As a licensed gun dealer under federal law, they could not give that weapon back to either of those parties because it would be illegal. However, if they're doing it on some other ground, simply because they don't think the person's fit or something, they're the ones that would have to be just that. They'd be both their potential liability, both criminally and civilly, for trying to hold that.
Would you say that you have what sort of discretion do you feel is available to you right now?
Well, I think all officers have a great deal of discretion. In fact, the bottom of the guy who's out there in the field most probably has the greatest discretion. It's much like a traffic ticket. If he feels that a citation is warranted, he can issue that, or if he feels that a verbal warning or a written warning will suffice, he has that authority to make that determination.
Could you tell us how you set your priorities on issues like this? Is your office enforcing SB 941 right now?
We have not had any cases on Senate Bill 941. It's not the top of our priority list. Obviously, being that most of the timber finance counties we're dying on the vine slowly. We don't have sufficient people to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I no longer have any full-time detectives. So our first priority is protecting people's lives, and then after that comes property. So, this would fall more in the area of a violation, or at least some type of statistical crime. And so if one were to come up and it was necessary, we'd go after it, but it's not something we're going to drop other things to do. Simply, we don't have the resources to do that.
Let's go back to Rob Taylor for a moment, the chief petitioner on M6151. Rob, we've heard that there are cash-strapped counties where investigations for misdemeanors, for example, just are not a top priority. I wanted to ask, do you feel that the extra step is really needed?
What do you mean, the extra step of passing Measure 6151?
Well, at risk of giving short shrift to the state law, it sounds like there are definitely counties with resource problems that may not be taking a tough enforcement stance on SB 941 already. Why then is a measure initiative necessary?
Because once again, it gives us the opportunity to challenge it in a court of law. Plus, it also guides the language in the measure encourages not only the current sheriff, who's a very good sheriff, but it encourages any sheriffs to follow to always put this at a lower priority and to basically ignore the law by not funding the law, because all of the resources are taking out of funding SB 941 through the measure that we are trying to pass.
Tell me a little bit more about possible legal challenges to this. What kind of issues do you hope that might resolve?
Well, that's one of those things that it would be hard to speculate because there are so many different scenarios that I couldn't even determine what might be something that would trigger a legal challenge. But I think it's something that we as citizens have to start doing because we have legislators who just don't seem to understand different parts of the state that they're representing, because I believe more than half of the states, the county sheriffs have chosen to put this law, the background check law, at a very low or no priority level.
Rob, how are you liking the chances on the measure campaign right now? What do you think the chances are that it will pass in Coos County?
Well, if I was a gambling man, I'd put a C note on it right now.
Okay. Sheriff Zanni, could I ask you the same question? What do you think the chances are that this will pass?
I think there's a very good chance it'll pass. I think, as I said, part of it, I think, is some people support it simply for the symbolism of it, is the fact that 941, it's, as I've told other people, I appreciate both sides. I don't see evil intent by anybody doing this. Everybody wants to be safe. Unfortunately, we live in a world that the problems we have are deeper and more complex than can be resolved on a one piece of paper by saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're either going to require everybody to have background checks, or we're going to have the sheriff make constitutional decisions. I don't think it's that simple, but I think it's symbolic of people saying, let's address the real issues. And the real issues in our community is, what do we do with people who create crimes? And the bigger and more pressing issue is, what are we doing about people who are suffering from mental illness or disease? Because I think we're doing a lousy job of that. I didn't say poor, I mean lousy. And everybody's intent's good, but we're not really addressing those issues, in my opinion.
Whether we're talking about the question of violence that comes in the form of a mass shooting or the gun violence that happens every day, if this is not a complete approach, what do you think the right step forward is?
Well, I think first of all is to sit down and get everybody to look and determine what are the biggest issues. Now, you mentioned gun violence every day. I can tell you in my part of the world that's not a real issue. And along with the symbolicism of this particular initiative that was put on the ballot, it's interesting to see that in most of the country, the places where there are more concealed handgun licenses and more handguns and less restrictive laws, violent crime's gone down. And you take Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Washington, D.C., Detroit, that have the strictest gun laws in the nation, and they have a growing crime rate, and their problem gets worse. I think that people need to sit down and look at the actual facts rather than make bullet points that are talking points put out by somebody from one side of the issue or the other, and actually look at real-world situations and deal with those.
We've been talking with Coos County's Sheriff Craig Zanni and with Rob Taylor. He's the chief petitioner for Coos County's Measure 6-151, which is going to be on the ballot on November 3rd. Gentlemen, I want to say thanks to both of you. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Coming up after a break, we're going to talk a little bit more about mental health and gun policy implications. You're with Think Out Loud on OPB. It's Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm April Baer. Discussions of gun law have become increasingly drawn together, for better or for worse, in public opinion, with our conversations about mental health. Chris Boniff is the executive director of NAMI Oregon, and he's joining us in studio this afternoon. Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
We just heard from the sheriff of Coos County, who feels that instead of focusing on gun laws, that the debate needs to focus closer on mental health. What's your response to that?
Well, it's a nice sentiment, but it's misguided in the sense that gun violence and mental illness do not correlate. So while we would love attention on our mental health system and improving our mental health system, if you want to focus attention on that with the expectation that you're going to affect gun violence or violent crime, it's misguided.
OPB commissioned a poll earlier this month that asked people what they think causes mass shootings. Again, with the understand this is just one segment of gun violence. The most popular answer was unidentified or untreated mental health problems. What do you think when you see that getting such a strong response out of polls?
In our country, when something happens, particularly something very extreme, very tragic, hard to understand, we all grapple for reasons. Why? No matter where you fall on the spectrum of debate over gun safety, gun control legislation, the only common ground people can land on is this is so out of normal behavior. This is something none of us can understand. It must be some type of mental health disorder that is the cause of this. Because it's that common ground, people are willing to focus on that. And because people are willing to focus on that and continue to focus on it, it's no surprise that public opinion would be reflective of that. Unfortunately, again, you could have the best mental health care system in the world, and it's not going to prevent violent crime, and it's not going to prevent gun violence in general. We're talking about really 3% of all violent crime has some relationship to mental illness. So 97% of our violent crime out there, including a good majority of these mass shootings, are not due to mental illness.
In the same poll, many people who responded also expressed support for requiring a mental health screening before they're allowed to purchase before people are allowed to purchase certain weapons. Is that something you'd support?
I don't know practically how you would do that, what a screening would look like. I mean, that's a lot to ask of a healthcare system and a healthcare issue to begin predicting who or who won't have some propensity to violence. I mean, we can't do that now. There are very broad risk factors that we know of, but they apply to millions of people who will not commit any type of offense. So how do you apply that? To me, it's very unworkable to ask a healthcare system to do something like that.
What do you think is the best way of improving our safety without infringing on people's rights?
Well, I think you need to talk about, particularly as we talk about the relationship of mental illness and access to firearms in a public health context. Really what the problem is here when we talk about firearms and mental illness is suicide. Suicide is the number 10 killer in our nation. It's the second leading cause of death for people from 15 to 34 years old. It's in the top 5 from 10 years old up to about 54 years old.
I was interested to read. I saw a Washington Post article this morning that said that if I'm reading these numbers correctly, half of suicide deaths stemmed from attempts involving a gun.
Right. So 51% of all suicides that lead to death, attempted suicides that lead to death, are committed by firearms. And it, not surprisingly, is a very lethal means. So of those who utilize firearms in an attempt, about 85% of those attempts lead to a fatality. So if we are going to talk about mental illness and firearms, what we should be talking about is in the context of public health and in preventing suicide and preventing self-harm rather than in context of preventing some violent crime.
Well, it seems like we do get essentially back to the same question, even if we're approaching firearms from the perspective of preventing suicides. It's still how do you create more safety and protect people without infringing on their rights to their
well,
constitutional
I think
rights.
Again, there's a lot of questions that we have that need to be examined and answers generated from that. Unfortunately, in our country, because of the political debate surrounding this issue, because you have people on the margins, one side or the other, engaged in this debate, and unfortunately, life is not lived on the margins. Everyday life is in the middle. There are questions that should be studied in terms of a public health context. Well, 20 some years ago, our nation made the decision legally to prohibit such research. So you can't spend federal dollars within our healthcare research institutions, federally funded, examining that question. If someone is identified at an elevated risk of self-harm, for example, what should a healthcare system do to assess that risk and to prevent access to firearms or restrict access to firearms in a way that keeps someone safe?
Is involuntary commitment the appropriate benchmark from which to consider this? Meaning to say, a person when background checks are conducted now, it's not as if anyone who's ever been diagnosed with a mental illness is automatically disqualified. Is involuntary commitment an appropriate place to draw the line?
Probably not. in sense that if I'm involuntarily committed and 25 years later I have no other episodes and I'm prohibited from exercising what our nation has deemed a personal liberty, probably not a good marker. Again, it's probably the only marker we have in terms of the political process. Again, politically, most people can agree that if someone is involuntarily committed, somehow that signifies that they are forever at elevated risk of committing some form of violence against themselves or others. And so we use that as a marker. And again, in a debate that is really a political debate, but does touch on healthcare, that's a common ground that people on each margin can agree upon.
I was struck by something you said a couple of minutes ago. What does it mean to approach this issue from a public health perspective?
It means to look at this in a healthcare context. So again, all of our suicide prevention efforts in this country, and we have a lot of them, none of them touch on access to firearms. None of them touch on if someone is at elevated risk and they do have access to firearms, how in a healthcare context should we respond? How do we diminish that risk? We can't study these questions in a healthcare setting or from a healthcare lens. We can only address these questions in this country right now within a political context. And so the institutions that you would have asking these questions, again, like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or the National Institutes of Health, they can't study these questions.
We got a question over Twitter from RW who writes, out of curiosity, who has the best mental health system in the world? Have we really researched this? And does that country have less gun violence?
Well, so that's a good question. There really isn't an ideal system out there. I mean, this is a problem that plagues the globe. There's not a country out there that you can hold up and say this is the gold standard for mental health care. In terms of how the interplay of gun violence in different countries, I mean, in looking at studies, the United States, as far as I'm aware and reading the literature, is the only country that really has free access to firearms that we do. Other countries, they have the same prevalence of mental illness. They have many of the same difficulties we have, but they don't have the feature of the firearms within their context of their country. So that may explain one reason why you don't see more gun violence in other countries.
Is it difficult to extricate as people continue to ask these questions? Is it difficult to extricate the two policy discussions? Do you think that's even possible?
It is kind of possible, and I think in our state it is shown possible. So in the past, when we've had, go back to Clackamas Town Center shooting, following that event, our state could have devolved into a discussion over mental illness and firearms, and we didn't. Our policymakers in the state legislature actually said we're going to do better by our mental health care system because this is good health care. And they didn't make that correlation. And you saw the state make some significant investments in our community mental health system. Certainly it's a drop in the bucket. It's not a cure-all. But I think in our state, at least, we have made that shift. Even after an event in Roseburg that has happened, you just don't see the conflation because I think you do, at least in Oregon, have an understanding that these two events are not necessarily related. There are some instances where mental illness and mass violence do interplay. But that's not the rule for circumstances like this.
What's the top of your list in terms of appropriate steps forward?
Well, I mean, again, in the context of let's remove guns from the equation whatsoever. Really, it's about, are we integrating our healthcare system to involve mental health and addiction services? Are we identifying folks? Are we helping them stay on what's a relatively normal life path? Are we preventing people from reaching a severity of their symptoms that leads to a catastrophic result, such as homelessness, incarceration, many of these things that we deal with within the context of our mental health care system. In terms of firearms, really what a lot of us hope is we begin studying that question. If someone is at elevated risk of self-harm, how do we address the issue of firearms and access to firearms during that period that someone is at risk of that harm? And if we can in this country, there are a lot of questions that we're asking that need to be asked. At some point, this nation has to put its research muscle behind examining those questions so we can come to some answers that we can address in our healthcare system.
Chris Boniff is the Executive Director of NAMI Oregon. Chris, thank you for coming in and talking with us about this today.
You're welcome.
That wraps up our discussion today. You're welcome to continue the conversation online. Try our Facebook page, and you can also find us on Twitter at OPB Think Out Loud's production staff includes Julie Sabatier, Dave Blanchard, and senior producer Allison Frost. Zach Carver-Gustin and Hakeem Hasworth engineer the show. Our technical director is Stephen Cray. We get production assistance from Alan Montecilio, and the executive producer of Think Out Loud is Sage Van Wing. Tomorrow on Think Out Loud, we're going to turn seasonal. We're going to talk to some symphony musicians about playing along with film screenings. There's a couple of offerings on the spooky side in performance in Oregon this weekend. Now, you don't have to miss out on any of our shows. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And the nightly rebroadcast can be heard tonight at 8 p.m. From all of us here at Think Out Loud, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm April Baer. Have a great day.